What's up, Saints? How y'all doing? Today we're gonna look at a video clip, again from the debate I had with Godless Engineer, in which also the New Testament gets brought up, but this time, to try to downplay the reliability of who the authors were, we try to see if Papias is reliable, but even let's say if Papias isn't a reliable source, what about the others who are then mentioned that give credibility to the names of the authorship of the New Testament Gospels? Let's take a look.
Why don't you give one thing from the New Testament that you think is convincing to the existence of Jesus and would be would seem to invalidate mythicism? And that way we're not having like 5-10 minute blocks of each other. You guys have a more back and forth dialogue. So what do you think from the New Testament you want to talk about with Godless Engineer that you think will demonstrate that Jesus was an actual person?
Right. Well, I would think the Gospels, for one, would be a good case of that, for relying on Matthew and John being eyewitnesses. Mark is getting his information from an eyewitness of Peter, and then you have Luke gathering his from multiple different eyewitness accounts, as he proclaims in Luke chapter 1.
Okay. Well, for one thing, of course, I don't adhere to the whole idea that they were written by firsthand accounts. For one, one of the possible sources, which I mean, Christian Anarchist didn't really give any reasons as to why he thinks that, like, let's say, Mark was an assistant to Peter, and he was recording firsthand accounts from Peter. Christian Anarchist, could you tell me why you specifically think that?
Why Mark is getting his information from an eyewitness?
Right.
Right. I forget who exactly are the 2 or 3 church fathers that mention the quote about who is attributed to these Gospels, and some of whom were even taught by people that were taught by the disciples themselves. So they're getting this information from there in the line, that, John wrote his, Mark wrote his, but not as an eyewitness, but that he was receiving Peter's testimony and writing it down under his name as Mark. Luke wrote his, gathering information from other people, and then Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew dialect in reference to using languages and terms in the Greek that would only be a familiar concept with the Jewish people, since he was a Jew.
Okay. Just to refresh your memory, it's Papias. Papias was the answer we were looking for.
That's one of them.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's the earliest one, and he's the source of saying that Mark was an assistant to Peter and was recording what Peter was saying. Papias is known to take hearsay as being more truthful than actual evidence. So, I mean, Papias isn't really a good source to go from. He's basically like a 2nd century 9/11 truther in that respect. I mean, like, just for instance, one thing that's not regarding to the Jesus question or the Mark question, he described a guy basically like a horrible anime kind of torture. I mean, he describes a guy as having like a huge head that with sunken eyes that even doctors couldn't detect his eyes, and he apparently had worm-infested genitals, and whenever he peed, he'd pee out worms everywhere, and he just he would basically hear something and take it as truth.
Well, the thing is, you keep focusing on Papias and all that with regards as if this has to be where it's originated, when another idea is, well, you have also then Irenaeus, which sure, he's a bit later, but then who was he a disciple of? He was the disciple of Polycarp, of whom was a 1st century figure, in which the only surviving letter we have, I forget which church he wrote to, but all we have is his one epistle, and he's from the 1st century. And he was taught by the disciple John. So one issue is, while sure, Papias could be one source that gives this out, but only by the written documents that we have so far, could also be, well, then it's also possible from Polycarp, though Polycarp we only have one letter that we know of that he wrote about, of whom he could have also gotten his information from John, since we know from sources that he was taught by the disciple John. And so we have that chain in which Irenaeus is getting his information, since he was a student of John. So I'd see that as a very viable thing, and I don't put too much of my trust and faith just on Papias alone. In fact, I wasn't even going to mention Papias at all in this entire discussion.